I was wondering in the crowd today, who else is a native seed vendor or supplier? I know we have Josh Buck from Granite Seed. Is there anybody else here who sells plants or seeds or collects? Can you tell us your name?
Yeah, I'm Ian Meisner. I'm the manager of High Mountain Nursery.
High Mountain Nursery, fantastic. Okay, anybody else? Any other seed plant vendors? So for those of you that want to be doing revegetation, talking to these guys, talking to Shane, talking to Jeff at lunchtime. I know, Shane, you have to leave after lunch, so he won't be on the field tour, but making sure you're making connections with people that you want to be working with for obtaining the seeds and plants you want for restoration. So our last topic here is the timelines for doing this, both on the vendor side, like what do they actually need if you want new species or just maybe species they have in stock. And then Chad is going to talk about the timelines for installation, particularly from DWR's point of view and some of the constraints that they face that maybe some of you face as well, and that how that drives when they actually do installations, seedings, and plantings. And I'm going to just lay a little bit of context here, again drawing from our surveys of managers and vendors. What we heard from a lot of vendors from throughout the region, plan, plan, plan. I think from those of us that are doing revegetation, the more notice we can give people about what we want, particularly if it's a harder to acquire species or harder to propagate species, they need to know ahead of time. Even more so, we heard over and over again how important contracts are. And so for those of you that work with agencies, you have limits with the contracts you can sign. But we started brainstorming some interesting options for contracts between Forestry Fire State Lands and DWR state needs in Utah versus what, for instance, North Fork Native Plants needs. And maybe Jeff can talk about that in a minute here. And having a deposit too for the native plant growers. They're investing so much into that production. So often they can't wait until the end to get paid because it might be a couple years of producing sod mats, for instance. And then on the field needs, what we heard over and over again, and of course we've experienced this as well, is that water is really the biggest biological constraint. Seeds are very, very picky and vulnerable. Plugs are as well. Sod mats are a little bit less so, but you know, there are just big challenges as in our increasingly water scarce future. And then also each agency really seems to have different logistical constraints. You live that every day, and Chad will talk about that from the DWR perspective, what those constraints are. So I'm going to ask Jeff to come and talk about the timelines for their plug and sod mat productions, and so you have a better sense of what they face on their end, so you can work better with folks like North Fork Native Plants.
I think we've already covered a lot of the constraints that we face as growers. And essentially the message is the more custom the product, the longer it takes us to get you what you need. One of the reasons we got into growing a lot of stock mats speculatively was because when we started growing pre-vegetated coir, it wasn't new to the world. You know, the Germans have been doing it for a while, and we saw a huge application here. And when we started to work with some of the growers at that time who we were accustomed to working with, they liked the idea, and I said, well, you know, how long would it take to get the product? And it was 2 years out. And that just doesn't work for a lot of people. So we do offer a lot that are in stock. Again, I would classify these plants as workhorse species. We tend to put like a 3 species mix in a mat. The reason being is that even with our best monitoring, hydrologic monitoring on the front end and understanding the site, we get wild cards all the time with hydrology, and you need a mix of species that will sort out if things go south. So if it turns out to be a lot wetter than you anticipated or a lot drier, we like to have some plasticity in the mix so that at least one of those plants will be able to survive and thrive on your site. That's why we have the poly mixture of plants. Recognizing when you you know, when we walk out here, these plants are really sorting out in patches, especially with the very wettest graminoid species. There's not a lot of integration of plants. But we put the 3 species in for that reason, if you were ever wondering. Having said that, I had a good conversation at the break. We could change the species with a custom grow. Not only would we need the seed, but we would also need your advice on how these communities work in the places that you work. Right, so we wouldn't want to take seed and plant, say, 5, forbs, and then maybe we have 1 graminoid, and we plant them all at the same density and composition, and then we end up with 1 graminoid. So we would want to know from you how we should plant them. If one's much more aggressive, we would want to know that. So I guess the story on timing is you can call and get some workhorse product very quickly, typically. And when we start to get custom, it can be 2 or 3 years. When you start to look at collecting the seed, pre-treating the seed, getting it, and some of those pre-treatment times are quite long, 150 days, 120 days. So you can start to work backwards. We offer on our website sort of a cheat sheet on when we'd like to see the seed. We're getting seed now, and then we're cleaning it again and putting it into pre-treatment based on the species requirements. And we love the custom grows, but they do take time. That's the moral of the story.
Okay, we're going to hear from Shane now, and Shane looks a little stunned again.
Thank you for that unflattering.
Oh. You were working hard cleaning seeds. So Shane is going to talk about what timelines he works with seed collecting, and particularly if you could talk about if people have new species they might want to get collected, what kind of notice do you actually need to get people what they need?
Absolutely, yeah. No, so timelines, again, just as Jeff has indicated, planning is so crucial and so important in letting us know where to spend our time. Because oftentimes we focus on what we think we can make money on. Unfortunately, that's what we're in the business for. I'd like to think that we're, part of the solution as well, but definitely, we have to make decisions based on where the economics are. And so if there is something that you are interested in, because oftentimes our vendors are kind of doing a guessing game. We can suppose that at least with the workhorse species, there's probably going to be a good amount of demand on it. But when it comes to these other and what appears to be a lot of more wetland forbs, I don't see the same amount of demand and to be quite frank, availability, just mainly because of just collection restraints. Some of the public lands are not really open to us all the time, and there's a lot of limitations. It's usually more common with the federal government, not to pick on them, but that's usually where a lot of our headbutting lies in trying to get permits, because we got to line up permits in the process right in the early spring. And then, there's a lot of, some of these species, there's a high degree of variability of when they put on seed. I mean, I'm collecting from anywhere from April all the way till November, sometimes even with like some of the workhorse species, because some of them will actually last, like inland saltgrass. It's not uncommon for it to have seed this time of year. So if usually a year ahead of time is a good idea at the very least, and if it is that season, there's also the constraints that comes with getting the material cleaned. Because if I'm not collecting material and I'm having to spend more time, cleaning for a certain deadline, that takes away from my earning potential. So that's the difficulty of balancing that act, is keeping customers and vendors happy, but also being able to collect adequate amounts of seed for these projects. So if you are interested in these kind of rare, more uncommon species, quantity matters. If you're ordering a couple pounds, you're not going to hook me as a fish, so to speak, and I'm not going to take the bite because it's just not worthwhile. By the time I do that's one little custom collection, I'd have to charge you astronomical prices, and you could get it elsewhere cheaper, and that's where the problem lies. I was just doing research the other day, and on a couple species, trying to make it more worthwhile on my end. And what ended up happening was I was calling these vendors, and the prices that I was wanting for material that was coming from Utah is the retail prices they're selling for. Because on my market is mostly, I'm kind of more selling in bulk, and I'm kind of on the non-retail side of things. So I don't really get to see where this seed goes to and the projects it's used to. So definitely, the more collaboration and education you get. I remember, and just in Farmington Bay, I was involved with a project that eventually, it was a UDOT property that eventually got transferred over to the DWR, and they were asking for species that I personally knew wouldn't grow there. And that was like kind of it's hard to scare away business, but at the same time, I was trying to be upfront, like, this will not grow here, it's just so you know. So there's limitations there too. And challenges, because what's available is available, but sometimes it would be better to delay, get the material that you really need that will actually grow, rather than just proceed with the project, and then you just end up with a bunch of weeds and stuff that just doesn't belong there in the first place. So, is that covered? Thank you.
Okay, so our last speaker here is Chad Cranney, and he's going to talk about when they often have done plantings and what their constraints are and some of their experiences from installations. Chad is from Utah Division of Wildlife Resources.
Okay, thanks, Karin. Excited to have such a big group here and talk about all this. And one of the things that most land managers and practitioners that are here today probably experience as we do is this isn't the only thing we do, is go out and plant plants, and we have so much other stuff that we have to do throughout the year, and we probably all want to try and do more of this. I know every year me, David, Rich, Keith are always like, yeah, we wanted to go plant this, didn't have time. We wanted to plant this, didn't have time. So just because of our work plans and stuff, a lot of this wetland planting and seeding happens pretty much in May for us, with maybe a week or so in April and a couple weeks into June. That's probably the bulk of it. So a pretty tight time frame. At that same time, we're also doing a lot of other type of plantings. We're doing some, we all grow some food plots on our uplands for wildlife. We also plant shrubs and shrub rows. So May is kind of like our planting month for a lot of things. We have done some plantings, wetland plantings and shrub rows later on in the year, like in September, which have done really well. But I think we've maybe done that once or twice. Those September timeframes are super hard for us, especially when we open to the public and are trying to facilitate hunting and visitors and stuff by October. Both, I'd say, have done really well. We've had some really good success with planting sod mats and plugs in May. We also, at least For me personally, I like to try and do this earlier in the year, just for the fact that these later September plantings, which will work, but I want to try and get these roots and rhizomes established for quite some time, because October, we have a bunch of knuckleheads out there trampling around in the mud and and the weeds and stuff, and building blinds and cutting stuff. So we want a long season for those roots and rhizomes to get established. Really, I think that's about it. Any other questions? Perfect.
That last bullet point on there was from the sod mats that we planted last September. It was a big collaboration between USU, DWR, and Forestry Fire State Lands. And so it was definitely a later sod mat installation than we have done before. And part of it was needing the time for the sod mats to establish that year. But we also wanted to see our growing seasons are going later and later. And if during the summer a lot of areas are going very dry, the thought was if we get these in I think it was actually the last day of August, we still had about 3 weeks before the sites were reflooded for the fall hunt. And we'll talk about this in the field. It required some artificial irrigation for about 3 weeks, which was quite a lift for us, a whole bunch of us, but they did end up really flourishing by spring of this year, so that was exciting to see. Okay, so we have a few minutes for questions here. I would welcome the other panelists to maybe be ready to jump up if there are questions. But what do people want to know more about? And then we will follow up on this too in the field. So, Jeff Richards.
Chad, just a question for you. Looking at that last slide, you had Phragmites on that fourth thing. What are you doing to stabilize or to prepare that soil and get it ready for these sod mats? How long in advance? What's the process?
Okay, so the question was, how do you prepare the soil for the sod mats? We didn't do anything.
Yeah, so I'm not super familiar with this particular picture. I think this is down at Farmington.
This is where we planted last.
Okay, but we did nothing to prep the soil there. It was basically, we picked a spot where we thought the water line would be, so some of this sod mats would be in the water, maybe a little bit would be out, allow some fluctuating water levels, but we just rolled them out and staked them down.
Are you planning to top the Phragmites?
No, we're trying to find bare areas, bare mud. Possibly there might have been some frag control and removal in a couple spots, but basically bare mud.
I think the soil prep was 6 years of Phragmites.
He says the prep was 6 years of Phragmites removal, absolutely, and we will go see that this afternoon. You'll notice, I don't know if you can see in that photo, but the sod mats are actually running perpendicular to the water line, which is different from what a lot of installations have been, and what the general instructions are, and that's because we're trying to hedge our bets there, because we know the water levels go up and down so much, so we actually oriented them 90 degrees the other way. Dave in the back there has a question.
Yeah, my question's along the same lines. I mean, in terms of the custom growing, you really have to plan ahead, right? And then you also talk about the importance of conditions, water availability, site conditions. Great to hear that some cases no prep is needed, but if you're thinking about planting in the fall, and I'm curious how you did this irrigation when you planted in the fall, but also just what else you might need to be troubleshooting when it's okay, the plants are ready, this is what we planned on, now it's time to plant, but it's super dry, or conditions aren't like that.
That's a big question. I think there are a lot of layers in there. So basically, what are all the things you have to consider when you're going to be doing a fall planting and things that could go wrong? How do you adapt to that? Is that maybe?
Yeah, or
Yeah.
if not that, just how did you do the supplemental watering?
Yeah, okay, so we will show that this afternoon, or we won't literally show that, but we'll talk about that. But basically, we had some trash pumps from DWR, Forestry Fire State Lands, and we had a crew of 2 to 4 or 5 people watering them every other day. It would take about an hour to an hour and a half. The logistics were super hard for the USU people because we're an hour and a half away. So that was great when the Salt Lake Focus people could come. You know, the driving time ended up being such a massive, I can see some of my team giggling about this in the audience. It kind of crushed us, frankly, because we had a whole bunch of field work going on and all these guys were getting busy getting ready for the hunt too. So it was terrible timing. But we did make it happen. And I do think we were very worried about ice damage. Particularly for the mats that were inside the Teal Lake unit, and we didn't know if the roots would have had enough time to establish, but we staked them following the protocols from North Fork Native Plants, and those plants and the mats did super well. They had long enough to get some of the roots down. Between that and staking them, they held their own. I didn't see a single one. Did you see any, Dave, that got washed up? I think everything. It was kind of a minor miracle, and then by early summer, they were really green. They were very green. They did very well. They grew a lot this year. They seem to have had quite a bit of drought stress later this summer, 2024, and so they're pretty yellow now, but things have been reflooded again, so we'll think they'll get even more resilient as they get more roots going. Bo had a question?
Yeah, I wondered if anybody had any experience planting immediately after a frag kill. And if they tried to do that after you rolled or anything, putting any of those mats down or seed.
Any mats? Yeah.
Or plugs, whatever, in one of those environments where you just killed the frag the previous year, you feel like you got a good kill. That's where we're concerned about regrowing vegetation, right? As quickly as we can. So
Yeah.
the frag has to take back over.
Okay, so the question is, has anybody seeded or planted aggressively the year after a very good frag kill? Chad, you coming up here?
Yeah.
Yes, okay, perfect.
Yeah, Bo, I don't think, we haven't done it that quickly. I mean, I think these areas that we're treating, we're trying to get a treatment cycle in there for at least 3 to 4 years before we really start thinking about throwing a bunch of money into plants and seeds. I will say I have often wondered how well some of these sod mats might do in areas where we've treated Phragmites and then gone in and mowed or rolled it. And you kind of have that thatch layer of dead material and stuff. I've been really interested in seeing how, just rolling one of these mats over that stuff and seeing how it would do. But no, we typically try and get a few years of treatments in before we start throwing money into planting.
So you're waiting until that plant material is broken up?
Yeah, for the most part we are, yeah. Yep.
More questions for you. Keith?
I have a question for you about genetics. So there's, I guess 2 questions. The first one is, the vendors that are providing these workhorse species, they have a lot of them on hand.
Yep.
How concerned should we be about implementing with off-the-shelf workhorse species regarding their genetics?
Yep.
And then the second question is, if you're going to custom grow, what are some factors you think about in terms of genetics?
Right, okay, so if you couldn't hear Keith in the back, the question was about genetics and where should you be sourcing your plants from and your seeds from? And my response is going to be based on what we have we've done a small amount of research, largely with bulrushes, with hardstone bulrush, alkali bulrush, and 3-square bulrush. And we actually did some genetic sampling from up and down the flyways and out at Fish Springs National Wildlife Refuge, basically just trying to get a sense of how much diversity is within sites and how much diversity is there across sites and how closely related are things. And one of the things that was really surprising to me was there's evidence for huge amounts of gene flow, which essentially means those seeds are being moved very long distances by migratory birds. So if I was thinking about what rules would I want to establish for myself, I would think I would really strongly try to get my seeds and plants from that are sourced from within that flyway. And then also, if I had options, I would get things from further south just because we're getting hotter and drier. So I would generally not try to get from more northerly populations and higher elevations. those are kind of the general rules. I will say for some of those pollinator species, they probably are much more restricted genetically, so sourcing them, more of those forbs and pollinator species, sourcing them closer when that's possible would be good, you know, like around Great Salt Lake and Utah Lake, but maybe not up to Cache Valley. But those graminoids that are, you know, if you opened up a gizzard of a duck, as we did in our lab 15 years ago, and we found all of these bulrush seeds in there, and it was an indication to us that these migratory birds are carrying, particularly alkali bulrush seeds, vast distances, you know, potentially hundreds, if not thousands of kilometers. Yep, Adrian.
How many of the graminoids we sell?
The question is, how many of these wetland graminoids are self-pollinate? I don't think we don't really have much research at all on pollination syndromes for any of these species. I would say, are you wondering, are they self-compatible? Or like,
I'll put some of the routes outside of the network, and you can sometimes have species that are so self-fertile.
yeah.
That they're like hitting rice grass or sand drops.
Mm-hmm.
That you end up having essentially three sort of subspecies growing together all the time and not interbreeding very much.
Yeah.
So then it depends on what kind of adaptation are you looking for in your location.
Yep.
So there may be already pretty diverse gene flow into relational roots, and maybe your main work is assumed to adapt to a certain language. But yeah, if you have time to go look into the biology of a common grass, and see is it selfing, does it have complicated ploidy?
Yeah.
So you can get really nerdy about it. But I would say you should just compare and ask.
Yeah, I will say that most of these species have been largely ignored. And I know you work much more in dryland and terrestrial systems, and so even seeding in wetlands has just not been nearly as common until, you know, the last 10 years or so. So we have a huge gap in our knowledge. We've been focused mostly on the seed aspects, like dormancy break requirements, what conditions seeds require. I will say from the limited genetic work that we did with some of the bulrush species, there is a fair amount of genetic diversity within a site, which I think is an indicator of more outcrossing than you might see with some self-pollinating or highly self-pollinating species. So, and that was surprising to me because they're clonal. And so you would expect with a clonal species, you might not see a lot of diversity because it might just be all one clone in one area. Actually, our genetic work showed the opposite of that. So seed production for some of these clonal species is still pretty important. Yeah, that's a great, yeah.
I think that the more you can't tell anything, you'll get surprised the more you learn. So you'll find
Yeah.
out there'll be some species that are super hybridizing and you just don't want to mix them impossible.
Yeah, that surely has to be the case with some of these forb species, and we just haven't looked into them at all. Any other questions from the audience? Yeah, Emily, and then I think Blake raised her. Yeah.
So I was wondering for the seed mats that have multiple species, what do you consider when selecting a species for those mats?
Okay, so the question, Jeff, when you have your sod mats, how do you decide what species, if you have more than one species in the sod mats, how do you decide what to put in there?
Yeah, so for us, we like to have enough of hydrologic diversity. So we tend to pick, you know, a rush and then maybe a couple of sedges, one being, you know, a lot more water loving than the next, because we're using these on a gradient, so we're not always entirely sure where the water will come in. When we know the site very well, it can be highly managed, we might grow a monoculture. When we're growing some of the bulrush species, they're almost all monocultures. And we have to be careful even within our facility. If we're putting multiple species in a mat within our 1 year of growth, one particularly aggressive species or that's most adapted to the conditions in our ponds will end up being the dominant species in the mat, even after a year. But those are some of the things that we consider.
Let's see, Blake?
Yeah.
Yeah, come on up.
So just related to this conversation and a point that Shane raised earlier, with the forbs, though many of these forbs are wide-ranging across the country, there's a lot of evidence to suggest, with the example of swamp milkweed, that our swamp milkweed could likely be elevated to its own species. So I would be very careful, like purchasing some of these over-the-counter seeds, particularly with ones like swamp milkweed. I would say, just in my observations, the eastern swamp milkweed tends to be significantly larger. There's also some evidence to suggest that some are clonal, but ours tends to be quite small, and it seems to actually occupy a different niche that the eastern swamp milkweed is not reported to occupy. So I just wanted to raise that as a caution, because yes, you can get 50 pounds of swamp milkweed very cheap, and probably, Shane would have to charge you a tremendous amount to get the same volume, but we need to work on domestic production for these species. And I think we can help bridge the demand for some of these species by making them more available, because they're so cost prohibitive right now to get some of these locally sourced forb materials. I don't think it's worth anyone's money to pay Shane to go out and get a few pounds of these, or another seed collector to get pounds of these, when you don't even know if they're going to work. But I'd like to start scaling up our domestic production, and I'd love to talk with any of you about that more. It's very accessible, and I think those can be explored in future conversations. But the other thing, just as another comment, in terms of what I do with the forbs, many of these wetlands are postage stamp size, is what I call them. So I am mixing populations. I'm considering historical connectivity, and I'm getting mints. I'll just use mints as an example, and Lycopus americanus, I'll source a whole bunch of populations together, and I'll put them all together in one of these wetland boxes or the same planting, because I'm trying to build in that genetic resiliency. These are clonal species. Many of them are restricted or reduced by historic human activity. So I'm trying to build in some genetic resiliency into some of these populations. But I'm definitely considering seed source is a very important aspect when I'm building a new wetland site. Yeah.
Do we know why some of these forbs are no longer abundant, and what the limiting factor is? Is it something that needs to be changed?
Oh, yeah. Countless things. 175 years of economic activity, I would say, is number one. So many of these forbs are not palatable to livestock, so you think that they should all be ecological increasers and doing really well. They are under moderate grazing regimes. If under heavy grazing regimes, I would say they disappear most often through trampling. And when you couple that with hay meadows, like too frequent of hay harvesting can be devastating to these, but the right balance of hay harvesting can be beneficial to these species and mimic that natural disturbance. But I would say many of them are very poor at dispersing themselves. Swamp milkweed is one of our success stories because it's capable of long distance dispersal. But many of the other forbs I work with, Joe Pye has the means of long distance dispersal, but it's not that great at it, at least not as far as my evidence suggests. And you'll notice weed is in a lot of their names. They can be very successful, they can colonize, they can get into places we don't want. But I think they have a really difficult time getting around. All these mints are, as far as I can tell, there's probably some biotic dispersal, bird ingesting them, getting stuck on mud on a bird's foot. But it's really the habitat fragmentation, the anthropogenic history within the state, and just related to the fragmentation, just that lack of connectivity. They have nowhere to go. They're stuck. They're on a functional island. They can't get to the wet meadow across the freeway any longer because we've cut off that space.
So the reason I ask is because if we were to reseed these,
Yeah.
especially pollinator species, would they grow and they can do well? What evidence do we have that there's something else that is in play, some other variable that maybe they won't do well?
So you're wondering, like, are there other factors at play that might be impacting the success of these species biologically?
If we were to reseed,
Yeah.
How successful would it be?
That's a great question, and I think we're in the very early stages of trying that. And Karin's lab is just starting to add a lot more of these species to their lists. There's a handful of species that I do seed that have done really well. I will always include some seeding as part of my projects, but in many cases, it's managing that hydrology. It's trying to get that zone right. And in many of the wetlands I work in, they're so degraded, and the soil conditions might not be right for their liking, that I've moved away from seeds because I might get, less than 1% to take. So I think that's a huge question in an area of research that we're seeking to answer, because especially working at these scales that Keith has to work in, we need to figure that out. And it's why it's so much easier to go to some of these tried and true workhorse species. But we need to start considering what else we want this habitat to be and what other ecological values these forb species can provide.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Other questions from the audience? Yeah, Ben.
For the seed collectors in the room, how much of a bottleneck is labor and kind of cost of labor on the collection end versus?
Yeah, and I would welcome our other seed collectors. Do you do seed collection? Just a little bit, not so much. Shane, do you want to address that question?
Labor can be challenging.
Would you mind coming up here? Sorry.
Absolutely, sure.
Yeah,
Sorry.
just for the mic. I know it's.
It can be challenging to find consistent labor is probably the biggest issue. There's also levels of trust that, it's kind of a barrier for me personally, if I'm being honest. Like I can create a competitor pretty easily after a season or two of getting to know. Nothing I do is all that sophisticated. If you ever see somebody beside the side of the road using a tennis racket and barrel, it might be me. So, I mean, some of it's really simple, not because I do a lot of hand collections, but some of these forb species, they do have an opportunity to be scaled up in more agricultural setting. So, not to take away from my opportunities, but it's kind of, there's a lot probably greater potential there if you're trying to scale up than there would be trying to do wildland collections. But labor, I can spend anywhere from $300 to $400 a day on a laborer just to do the collections. So I really do need to make for sure that number one, they're well compensated. It is a difficult task to do a lot of this work. I'm 45 and have pretty good arthritis set in, and I still go out in the field, but definitely, we're trying to mess around with different collection methods, but it's hard on you. And, younger folks are always welcome, but it is challenging to find labor that's consistent.
Other questions? Yeah, Adrian. Bottlenecks related to weed contamination? Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, do you want to go back over?
When you're talking these small custom collections and when you're trying to do certified seed it's a good concept, it's a good idea. It's not very practical in the field, especially with these smaller areas. We're trying to, and there is a level, I understand it keeps people honest, but that's the difficulty sometimes on our end, because it is kind of, we're doing our best to follow the rules and show where we got this material, but there's a little bit of exposure involved too, and so there's trust on issues on both sides that I've noticed, where there's demands for source ID. I do try to, at least on my workhorse species, I try to get those source ID'd, just because of economics. Even getting it tested, if you're wanting like maybe 20 pounds of say Joe Pieweed, maybe that's not a good example because it holds a high value, but some of these other forbs, like say, the swamp milkweed, it wouldn't make a whole lot of sense to me. Because you make let's say you do a 20-pound collection and the value of that particular seed is $25 per pound. So it seems like a lot of money, $500, right? So it seems good, but you got to get that tested from a state certified lab that's going to cost you at least $120. And then on top of that, a certification from Source ID is going to run you anywhere from $50 to $100, which is still a good deal. And that's just for that one site. If you want to get it certified, say, you're getting your material all over the place. And if you actually want to get it certified for all these various counties, you just run into a lot of difficulty. And I know that there is that aspect of wanting to get material that's actually sourced from that locality. But on my end, I see a lot of problem with making it economically feasible. So that's just the kind of the drawback. But I hope that answers your question. And if it doesn't, I'm sorry. Right. As far as the weed seeds and those things are concerned, that's always a constant concern. And there's material like on these workhorse species, some stuff that's considered crop in Utah, like say Garrison's foxtail or reed canary grass. You go into other states and it's considered a noxious weed. And here in Utah, it's not, because they use it as a lot of hay products and stuff. And maybe it should, because that one issue that I'm starting to have problems with is I can't keep it out of my seed, and it's a constant struggle. There's certain sites I can no longer collect on, like there's certain inland saltgrass sites that like are so contaminated with noxious weeds that I don't even bother, because it's just a waste of my time. I'd collect it and then I'd sell an inferior product, and then whoever, the vendor or the grower, they would just be mad at me because and we do our best to keep it out in the first place, but there's some things that sneak in. Thank goodness for testing, because sometimes that keeps us sharp and aware of what's going on, like when we do introduce some issues with that. But yeah, definitely that's becoming a bigger concern on our end of collections, and maybe it's probably, it's for certain species might be avoided in more agricultural settings. But
I think we've arrived. I think it's time for lunch.